The Young and the Restless spoilers Thurdays full the 8th of January 2025. While the aftermath of Matt Clark's failed assassination attempt still pulsed like an open wound through Genoa City Memorial, the rest of the Newman clan found themselves confronted by a new wave of uncertainty that rippled far beyond Nick's hospital room. Nikki Newman, already shaken by the horrifying realization that her son had nearly been murdered a second time, received a troubling phone call from the chief of staff hinting that certain details about the night's security breach were far more complicated than initially believed. Victoria, caught between protecting her daughter and managing Newman Enterprises' growing instability, sensed that another crisis was slowly tightening its grip on the family and that had nothing to do with Matt Clark, but would ultimately expose fractures they thought had healed long ago. And Victor, though still the pillar of strength at Nick's bedside, was forced to acknowledge that the danger surrounding his family was multiplying in ways even he could not immediately control. Elsewhere in Genoa City, the emotional temperature rose for entirely different reasons. At GCAC, Daniel Romolodi spotted Phyllis Summers before she saw him, her energy moving through the room like a wildfire barely contained. He approached cautiously, hoping for a civil conversation, though deep down he knew that civil was rarely Phyllis's default setting. When she finally turned and met his eyes, he could tell instantly that she was already analyzing him, already preparing her judgments and projections. Daniel tried to stay grounded as he revealed, almost tentatively, that things had shifted for him, that maybe his happiness no longer hinged on Heather Stevens. That maybe he could envision a path forward without the familiar emotional chaos of their relationship. But the moment the words left his mouth, Phyllis's expression sharpened, the tilt of her head signaling both suspicion and motherly over-interference. "Tessa, does she have something to do with this?" she asked pointedly, and the name struck Daniel harder than he expected. He tried to deflect, to redirect, but Phyllis was too experienced, too perceptive, too relentless to let the subject drop. She pushed again, sharper this time, demanding clarity. "Is she still married? Divorced? What exactly are you walking into?" Daniel bristled, not because she was wrong to question him, but because her voice carried that familiar tone implying he was repeating a generational pattern of emotional missteps. He resented that she could still make him feel like a reckless teenager, even when he knew his choices were grounded in genuine introspection. When Daniel refused to answer, the conversation took its inevitable turn, shifting away from his love life and straight into the territory Phyllis could never resist: power, legacy, and the idea of rebuilding something grand out of ashes she herself had helped create. Daniel, trying to make sense of the tension between them, asked carefully what project she was currently working on, what scheme or venture was keeping her restless, hungry energy alive. Phyllis straightened, almost triumphantly, as she explained that she had officially requested the Abbotts transfer ownership of Marquette to Summer. Her eyes gleamed with pride, ambition, and something dangerously close to delusion. Daniel blinked, taken aback. "Is this what you meant? The thing that could heal our family? Make everything right again?" he asked, struggling to reconcile her grand vision with the reality of their fractured relationships. "It could be our family empire," Phyllis insisted, her voice swelling with conviction as though she were unveiling a destiny rather than a corporate acquisition. For a moment, Daniel almost admired her ambition until the familiar dread crept in. He knew how easily Phyllis could turn a desire for reconciliation into a battlefield. He knew how quickly she could warp a good intention into a catastrophic miscalculation. He tried, gently at first, to tell her that honesty moderate, that building something worthwhile required transparency, accountability, ownership of past mistakes. But Phyllis recoiled as though the words themselves were an accusation. Her expression hardened, her shoulders tensed, and she snapped back with an edge he recognized all too well. "Daniel, things cannot work that way. Not in my world. Not ever." Her voice trembled with frustration or fear, or both, and in an instant the tenuous peace between them shattered. She lashed out, insisting that he didn't understand what was required to protect their family, claiming he was naive, foolish, unprepared for the darkness she believed she alone could navigate. And Daniel, exhausted and disillusioned, could only watch as his mother spiraled into the same pattern she always fell back on, anger, defensiveness, control. But the moment that truly unsettled him was not her anger, it was the flicker of desperation behind it. The unmistakable sign that Phyllis Summers was once again standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to throw herself into a storm she believed she could outrun. Meanwhile, across town, a quieter revelation brewed. Sienna and Tessa Porter, once connected through the chaotic creative scene in Los Angeles, found their pasts slowly circling back into their present lives in Genoa City. Their history complicated, artistic, tinged with ambition and emotional rivalry attend to intersect with the already fragile balance surrounding Daniel. And though no one in the Newman family yet knew the significance of this connection, it would soon play a far larger role than anyone expected. Because while Victor constructed traps to capture monsters like Matt Clark, another kind of storm, emotional, relational, unpredictable, is gathering just beyond their line of sight. Genoa City was shifting again, aligning its fault lines, preparing to shake every family to its core. And none of them, not even Victor with all his power, had any idea how deeply these smaller fractures would cut once they finally erupted. Nick Newman had fought his way through impossible situations before, but nothing compared to the suffocating terror of Matt Clark's hands tightening around his throat as they struggled inside the moving car. The engine roared beneath them, the road blurring into a dark, endless ribbon, while Matt's fingers dug deeper, cutting off Nick's breath with a murderous rage sharpened by failure and humiliation. Nick grasped desperately at Matt's wrists, his vision darkening around the edges, every instinct screaming for air. But he refused to die on a road in the middle of nowhere, refused to let Matt undo everything Victor had fought for to keep their family standing. Gathering what strength he had left, Nick slammed his foot on the accelerator in a burst of instinctive defiance, sending the car lurching forward with wild force. Matt was thrown back, but not enough to loosen his grip. Nick jerked the wheel hard, tires screeching across gravel, and for a split second the world seemed to tilt sideways before he stomped the brake with every ounce of strength in his shaking leg. The sudden stop hurled both men forward. Matt's grip broke, and the car spun violently out of control, metal grinding against metal as it careened off the road and crashed through underbrush before slamming sideways into a dense pocket of trees deep within the forest. Silence followed, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, heavy, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Nick's consciousness flickered like a dying light. Pain radiated through his ribs and leg, pulsing in sharp waves that made every movement an agony. He forced himself to breathe, to focus, to remember where he was and why he could not afford to collapse. He looked to the passenger seat, but Matt was gone. The door hung open, the forest floor disturbed by footprints leading away from the wreck. Matt had crawled out, vanished into the darkness, alive and free once again. Panic didn't come in grim determination. Nick knew he had seconds before his body gave out entirely. His hand shook violently as he reached for his phone, half wedged under the shattered dashboard. Glass cut into his palm as he pulled it free, but the pain barely registered. He pressed Victor's number from muscle memory, blinking through blood that trickled down his forehead. Miles away, at the Newman Ranch, Victor stood in the living room with the same tension that had haunted him since the night Matt infiltrated the hospital. Victoria entered, her tone calm but her posture tight, and asked whether there was any update on Nick's arrival at the police station. Victor, with the restrained certainty of a man who believed he had finally regained control, assured her that things were nearing their end. "I think this Matt nightmare is about to be over," he said, more to reassure her than himself. He told her Nick was personally transporting Matt to the police, framing it as closure long overdue. Victoria tried to believe him, tried to trust his judgment, as if Victor Newman said a threat was contained. History had proven it usually was. But then Nikki entered the room, her energy sharp and trembling with fear that had been building since sunrise. She demanded specifics, demanded clarity, unable to accept Victor's calm demeanor as truth. She knew him too well, knew that behind his stoic confidence lay a man who had already run 1,000 worst-case scenarios in his head. Victor attempted to soothe her concerns, insisting he knew how to protect his family, urging her to stop worrying over something he believed was already being handled. But Nikki, raw from fear and years of scars left behind by men like Matt Clark, pushed again. She needed details. She needed certainty. She needed Victor to admit that danger still lurked. Before he could respond, his phone rang. One look at the screen shattered his composure. Nick. Victor answered immediately, his voice firm, steady, masking the dread building in his chest. But the moment Nick spoke, everything changed. There's been an accident. Car crash. Matt, he got away. I can't move. I need help. The words came out broken, strained, soaked in pain. Victor's world narrowed into a single point of panic. He asked for Nick's location, demanded it, but before Nick could finish, there was a Thurdays heavy dropan, then nothing but static. The line went dead. The silence that followed was agonizing. Victor stared at the phone in disbelief, the reality hitting him with the full weight of a father who had been 1 second too late. Nikki covered her mouth, trembling. Victoria stood frozen, the air knocked out of her. In that moment, the illusion of control that Victor had maintained shattered completely. Matt Clark was not contained. Nick was not safe. And the nightmare was not ending, it was evolving into something far more unpredictable. Hours later, the sterile lights of the hospital cast their cold glow over yet another Newman crisis. Nick lay unconscious in a hospital bed, his leg immobilized, his breathing uneven. The doctors surrounded him, speaking in hushed tones as they updated the family. Nikki hovered closest, her hand trembling as it rested on Nick's arm. Victoria stood beside her, struggling to stay strong for her mother even as her heart raced with fear. Sharon and Noah arrived shortly after, their faces pale, their voices barely above whispers. Together, they formed a protective circle around Nick, the familiar Newman instinct to close ranks emerging once again in the face of danger. The doctor finally stepped forward and explained that Nick was stable, but had sustained multiple injuries, including a leg fracture that might require surgery depending on how the swelling progressed. Relief washed through the room, tempered by lingering dread. Because even though Nick had survived, the man who tried to kill him was still out there, lurking in the shadows of Genoa City with unfinished business. When Nick regained consciousness, pain etched into every breath. The first words he forced out were not questions about his condition or his family, were about Matt. He got away, Nick rasped, struggling to sit upright. You have to find him. He's not going to stop. Nikki touched his shoulder gently, her voice trying to steady itself for his sake. Sweetheart, your father is already handling it. But Nick shook his head weakly, the urgency in his eyes undeniable. He knew Matt in a way no one else knew, the obsession, the vengeance, the darkness that fueled him. And he knew with sickening certainty that Matt Clark was far from finished. And as the camera of that moment would linger on the fear and determination etched into every Newman face, one truth would hang heavy in the room like an approaching storm. Matt Clark was out there, wounded, cornered, desperate. And no one in Genoa City would be safe until the final chapter of this nightmare played out. The news that Nick would need additional imaging came like a dull aftershock rather than a fresh explosion, but it still rattled the room. The doctor explained that with a leg injury like his, X-rays were only the first step, and there was growing concern about the extent of the damage, potential fractures, and internal complications. Sharon watched as they prepared Nick to be wheeled down the hall, her heart clenched in that familiar vice that came every time one of her children disappeared behind hospital doors. Nikki stood on the other side of the bed, one hand on the rail as if to anchor him there by touch alone. Victoria listened closely to the medical details, absorbing words like stabilized, possible surgery, and monitoring swelling, translating them into their emotional equivalents, pain, risk, unknowns. Noah lingered a step back, arms folded but not in defiance, more like a makeshift shield against the rising guilt inside him. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on all of them. The car crash, Matt's narrow escape, Nick's broken body lying there because he had once again tried to protect his family. When the orderlies finally rolled the bed away, Sharon followed it with her eyes until it disappeared around a corner. And in that moment, the fragile illusion of control she had been clinging to unraveled completely. It was then that Noah spoke up, his voice hesitant but firm enough to cut through the low hum of machines and worried whispers. He wanted to go back to the ranch with Sienna, he said. Just for a little while. Just to make sure she was safe. To take her out of the shadow of everything that had happened with Matt. In his mind, it was simple. Sienna had been dragged into this nightmare, had faced her abuser, had watched the man who once terrorized her nearly kill his father. He needed to be with her to reassure both of them that they still had something solid to hold on to. But Sharon's reaction was immediate and visceral. The word no left her lips before she could soften it. Nikki quickly echoed her, not with anger but with the brittle desperation of a woman who had seen far too many moments like this spiral out of control. They knew Matt was out there. They knew he was wounded, cornered, and dangerous. The idea of Noah traveling, exposed and distracted, felt like tempting fate in the worst possible way. Sharon's mind raced with images of Matt crawling out of some ditch, tracking Noah, following him to Sienna, to the ranch, to the people she loved. She shook her head again, this time with more force, insisting that Noah stay close, that he stay where they could see him, where Victor's security could keep him in their orbit. But fear and love often pulled in opposite directions, and Noah was caught in the center of that tug-of-war. The more they tried to hold him back, the more urgently he felt the need to get to Sienna. He saw the terror in her eyes when they'd last been together, the way her hands shook when she said Matt's name. He knew what it meant to have your life controlled by someone else's violence, and he refused to leave her alone in that state. So when the doctor returned with the results and confirmed that Nick would need surgery on his leg after all, the hospital fell into another swirl of preparation, consent forms, signatures, scheduling, anesthesia explanations. Sharon and Nikki were pulled into a conversation with the surgeon, their attention split between medical terms and emotional survival. In that small window of distraction, Noah saw his move. Guilt nodded him even as he made it, but he stepped away quietly, as if just going to get some air. Instead, he slipped out of the hospital entirely, phone in his pocket, heart pounding with the knowledge that if his mother discovered he had gone directly against her wishes, it would bruise their already delicate trust. Still, he kept walking. Because in his mind, the risk of leaving was nothing compared to the risk of leaving Sienna alone. Back inside, Sharon eventually turned around, expecting to see her son leaning against the wall or pacing the hallway, and her chest dropped when she realized he was gone. Panic rushed in like an icy tide. She imagined Matt watching, waiting, recognizing that someone young and vulnerable had stepped right into his reach. Her breath shortened as worst-case scenarios stacked one upon another. She didn't just fear for Noah's safety, she feared what it would do to the family if Matt got to him first. At Sharon's small cottage, away from the relentless beeping of machines and the oppressive atmosphere of the hospital, Sienna Bacall sat alone on the worn couch, trying to quiet the storm in her own head. The house felt too still, the silence unfamiliar and almost hostile after so many hours of chaos and raised voices. She wrapped her arms around herself and repeated silently that she was safe now. Safe from her husband. Safe from the man who had reduced her life to a series of calculated fears and suffocating routines. She was in Genoa City, not Los Angeles. She was in a home that didn't belong to him, under the protection, however fragile, of people who understood what Matt was capable of. People who had been dealing with his darkness long before she ever realized how deep it went. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to catalog the things that surrounded her. The soft throw blanket draped over the arm of the sofa, the faint smell of coffee. A photo on the shelf of Sharon and her children, smiling in a moment that seemed almost unreal compared to the current tension. For a few precious seconds, she almost believed herself. Then there was a knock on the door. Her heart stopped. Sienna froze, every muscle tightening as adrenaline flooded every nerve. It could be Noah, she told herself, or Sharon. It could be anyone. But the timing, the stillness of the air, the way her skin prickled it, all dragged her back to nights in Los Angeles when unexpected knocks had meant screaming, apologies, or worse. She swallowed, gathering what courage she could, and moved toward the door. When she opened it, the last person she expected to see stood on the other side. Tessa. Not just a name from her past, but a living echo of a former life she had tried so hard to shut the door on. For a long moment, both women simply stared in disbelief, the years collapsing between them like a stage curtain dropping without warning. They had known each other in Los Angeles, back when Tessa was a struggling performer pouring her entire soul into small venues, and Sienna worked behind the scenes, handling sound checks, backstage coordination, and the million little details no one in the audience ever saw. Sienna had always watched Tessa from the wings, admiring the way she seemed to glow under stage lights. The way her voice could make a room full of strangers feel like they were being spoken to individually. Tessa, in turn, remembered Sienna as the quiet but sharp woman who knew everything that happened behind the curtain, the one who could smooth over disasters with a few hushed words and a steady hand. She remembered Tanner, too, how the three of them had once formed a strange constellation of ambition, music, and longing that never quite aligned the way any of them hoped. To stand here now in a quiet cottage in Genoa City, miles and years away from those smoky LA bars, felt surreal. Inside, the conversation unfolded in cautious layers, the past and present weaving together. Sienna introduced herself to this new version of Tessa Porter, who was no longer just the musician she'd once known, but someone with roots and family in this town. Tessa, bewildered but curious, asked what Sienna was doing in Genoa City, and why exactly she was at Sharon's house of all places. Sienna admitted that she had come from Los Angeles seeking something that might finally break the cycle she had been trapped on, and that something was Noah. Her voice faltered slightly when she said his name, betraying more emotion than she meant to. She tried to explain that her connection to him was complicated, tangled up in circumstances far beyond a simple reunion or rekindled romance. She wanted Tessa to understand that she was not here to play games or chase illusions. She was here because danger had followed her, and Noah was one of the few people who had ever made her feel like it might be possible to outrun it. Sienna then turned the questions around, asking how Tessa knew Sharon and Noah, how she had ended up here in this small town that now felt like a last refuge. Tessa, with a small, almost bewildered smile, explained that Sharon was part of a family she had married into, that Noah's sister, Mariah, was her wife. Genoa City, for all its secrets and scars, had become her home. It was where she had found something solid, something that didn't vanish at the end of a tour or dissolve under the pressure of the next gig. The revelation hit Sienna with a strange mixture of surprise and relief. Somehow, knowing that Tessa was tied to this family by love and not just circumstance made the room feel a little less foreign. As if this cottage were not just a hiding place, but part of a larger web of protection and connection. When Tessa gently pressed for the full story of why Sienna had really come here, the dam finally broke. Sienna told her everything about Matt Clark, about the control he exerted, the threats, the way he weaponized her fear and isolation. She spoke of the night he nearly killed Nick, of how she had realized that Matt's obsession was larger than her, that it extended into a twisted vendetta against the Newmans as a whole. She described the car, the police station plan, the crash, and the sick knowledge that Matt had survived yet again. The words spilled out faster now, years of bottled terror and shame finally given shape. Tessa listened, her face tightening with anger and sympathy. She had seen abusive men before, had watched friends lose themselves under the weight of manipulation and violence. Hearing Matt's name tied to Noah, to Nick, to Sharon, made her blood run cold. This was not just a story, it was a warning. Just as the air in the room became thick with the weight of everything they had shared, the door burst open and Noah rushed in. His eyes immediately found Sienna, and he crossed the space between them in a few strides, pulling her into a desperate embrace that spoke of relief, fear, and a fierce need to verify with his own hands that she was truly safe. When he finally released her enough to breathe, he noticed Tessa standing there, stunned but relieved to see him alive. There was a flicker of something almost nostalgic between them, the echo of that old LA chapter, but it was quickly overshadowed by the urgency of the present. Tessa told him everyone had been worried sick, that he had vanished from the hospital when emotions were already frayed to the breaking point. Noah, still panting slightly from the rush of adrenaline and the drive over, explained that he had come back alone because Nick had taken Matt in the car, intending to deliver him to the police. And things had gone horribly wrong. Sienna's heart sank as she pieced it together. She understood the subtext immediately. Nick had tried to take control of the situation, had put himself at risk to protect them all, and fattier cruelty. Or Matt's relentless darkness had thrown them back into chaos. She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, where Matt was now. The answer felt like a curtain dropping inside the room. Noah admitted that Matt had escaped, that after the crash he had vanished into the night, leaving only wreckage and injuries behind. The room seemed to contract around them, the fragile sense of safety dissolving in an instant. Sienna's mind raced, torn between guilt that Matt's presence in her life had led the Newmans into danger, and a cold, practical fear that he would not stop until he had reclaimed whatever twisted power he believed he held over her. Sharon's cottage suddenly felt far too exposed. Somewhere else in Genoa City, far from the warmth of the cottage and the hospital's sterile glow, Matt Clark lay in a filthy alley, his body battered and his wrists still partially bound by the rope that had cut into his flesh during the earlier struggle. He had managed to loosen it but not fully free himself, each tug sending sharp pain up his arms. The cold ground beneath him smelled of oil and waste, a stark contrast to the luxurious chaos he had tried to impose on the Newman's world. Yet even here, broken and breathing hard, his eyes still burned with venom. He muttered to himself in a low, ragged voice that this wasn't over, that Nick Newman had only delayed the inevitable. Nick would pay. All of them would. In his mind, the crash was not a failure, but a temporary setback in a war he refused to lose. He pulled again at the restraints, frustration growing with every failed attempt, until he leaned his head back against the brick wall behind him and sucked in a breath filled with rage. Then, slowly, a shadow fell across him. Matt opened his eyes, squinting up at the distorted silhouette looming over him, blocking what little light the alleyway offered. For the first time since the crash, uncertainty flickered across his face. He was used to being the one lurking in shadows, the one others feared to see when they looked over their shoulder. To be on the ground, looking up at someone whose features he couldn't quite make out, was a reversal he didn't like. Confusion knotted in his chest, warring with his instinct to snarl, to threaten, to assert control. He blinked, trying to focus, trying to identify the newcomer. Was it a cop who had finally tracked him down? A Newman security agent sent to finish what Nick had started. Someone from his past he never expected to see again? The figure stepped closer, their face still shrouded in darkness, and for the first time in a long time, Matt Clark did not have the upper hand. The last clear image before the scene cut to black was his expression no longer purely vicious, but unsettled, wary, and edged with something dangerously close to fear. Whoever stood over him in that alley had just changed the game. And Genoa City, already trembling under the weight of one nightmare, was about to discover that Matt Clark was not the only ghost walking its streets.